So good afternoon. My name is Rainer Arzbach. I'm Associate Professor in Historical Archaeology here at Aarhus University, and it's a pleasure for me to be your technical host today. I'll start with some brief technical information and a hearty welcome, of course, to all the participants outside. I see on the list we have visitors from Austria, USA, UK, Germany, and Denmark. This is great. And of course, a hearty welcome to our speaker, Kerr today, and to David Harvey, the director of our research program, Materials, Culture and Heritage, that is supporting our meeting, which is a cooperation with the Marburg Workgroup for European Castle Research, here represented by his president, Christian Ottersbach, and Dieter Lehmann. Dieter Lehmann and Margareta Pinter will later support me when collecting questions and answers. The audience is able to ask questions or to send comments using either the chat or the question and answer function. Please be aware that we are recording the session. So in case you are interested in that your comments are cut off and not published on YouTube, please send me an email and then we can cut you off in the post-processing, which will happen by my wife, Katrin Atzbach. Very, very many thanks to her. She edited our former 3 meetings of the series Strongholds of the World. You can see here on the slide, and I'll also try to put them into the chat now, that you all get the links and are able to see and watch our former conferences from the pilot castle in the Age of Pestilence, over Namhang San Seong in Korea, and Alexandria's urban defense, and last but not least, the coastal defenses of Maharashtra in India. And what will happen in the next moments, we'll listen to the official welcome by our director, David Harvey. Then Christian Ottersbach will follow with an official welcome and introduction, and we'll listen to Kerr. At about 2 o'clock, we will start with our question and answer session, our discussion. And explicitly, I want to invite you all participating in our discussion. Margareta will help me to give you a sound and a face. And please write into the chat if you are interested in commenting or asking questions. Thank you very much from my side, and I leave the floor to David.
Thank you very much for that, Rainer, and welcome everybody. And it's really is a great pleasure to be back with this series again, especially on a nice sunny day in Aarhus. I'm David Harvey, the director of the Materials, Culture, Heritage Research Program, and it's really one of the positive things, I guess, or one of the few positive things about the whole pandemic situation is that we've established these as a regular occurrence on the program now, a joint with Marburg, and it's been an amazing tour of fortifications around the world, from India to Korea to Alexandria, and now I'd have to say, at last, somewhere I've actually been to, I've got lovely memories of on a cycle tour around Orkney and Shetland about 10-12 years ago, and so I've actually, this is the first time we're going to see somewhere I've actually visited, and it was a sunnier day as it is on some of the photos there as well. So I can't, love to get back to Orkney again sometime to visit more. Yeah, really good pleasure to have Kevin along from Orkney, and I'll leave the formal introduction on to Christian to welcome Kevin to this group.
So also from my side, dear guests and friends of Strongholds around the world, a very warm welcome to all our spectators. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you in the name of the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies of Aarhus University and the Marburg Working Group for European Castle Research to the 4th part of our lecture series, Strongholds of the World. Our idea was to present a worldwide look on castles and fortifications, and mainly on non-European strongholds, opening the view on the phenomenon of fortified sites in their cultural background. Well, despite this, we will have today a look on the northwestern periphery of Europe. So I am the first chairman of the Marburg Working Group, Christian Ottersbach. For all who don't know us, shortly, our small society was founded at Marburg University in 1996 by, at that time, students and young academics of art history, and archaeology. One of our members is Professor Rainer Atzbach, archaeologist, and I'm glad that we have with him a good connection and relationship to Aarhus University. Without its power, we couldn't have organized such an international virtual lecture series via Zoom. And by the way, I have warmly also to give my thanks in the name of our society to his chief, David Harvey, for the possibility to organize this lecture series in collaboration with Aarhus University and his kindly support. Today, our virtual journey will lead us to the island of Gurness, part of the Orkney Islands. Our object is a broch, a very special form of strongholds in the north of the British Isles. I may now introduce to you a real expert on this subject, Kerr. Kerr has been involved in field archaeology for the last 13 years, with the last 6 based on Orkney. He currently works for the Orkney Research Centre for Archaeology as a field archaeologist. Kerr has been heavily involved in most of the major research digs on Orkney and has been the small finds officer for the Broch excavations since 2016. He's also a seasonal custodian at the Broch of Gurness for Historic Environment Scotland. Kerr currently is completing a Master of Research degree at the UHI based on the findings of excavations at the cairns and their implications for older excavations such as Gurness. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you, Kerr, to our today's event, and I have to thank you that you have found time for us. Kevin, the audience is now yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and hello to everybody who's listening in. And yeah, it's not a hardship talking about what I do. It's quite a passion. Essentially, I get paid to hang about the Broch of Gurness, which is what I do anyway on my days off even. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a long time in the making. It's been a number of years since I spoke to Dieter at the Broch of Gurness, and he first mentioned this idea. So it's fantastic to finally get it into fruition. I have pre-recorded this talk. So what I'll do now is I'll just share the screen, press play, and hope for the best that nothing goes wrong. Is that okay? Are we good to go? Yeah, so the way I thought I would frame this talk for you today is by breaking it down into 4 parts. An introduction to brochs. What are they? Where are they? Also giving you a little overview and insight really into broch studies, which is essentially a polite way of saying broch arguments. It looks at the sort of current and past interpretations of these structures. It's a very tall order to try and squeeze this topic down into a few minutes, but there's enough material that could fill a week-long lecture series here. But we'll give it a brave attempt. It's really just to give you a flavour of the subject if you're unfamiliar with it. Then I'll look at the site in question in a little bit more in depth. The wonderful Broch of Gurness, this broch structure and settlement that you can see on the screen here, and mainly at the interpretive legacy left by the major excavation in the 1930s. Bringing it right up to speed, we'll then have a look at the cairns, an ongoing broch excavation elsewhere in Orkney on South Ronaldsay. I'm very proud to be part of the team there, and the results were fascinating from that site and really have major implications on our understanding of life at that time. And then lastly, is there anything, what can we do armed with new information? Can we breathe new life into older sites such as Gurness, and I very much hope to convince you or to show you that there's major potential in doing so. So if you hold on to your hats, here's the location of Gurness. I'm very sorry, it's an incredibly fast descent. And here it is in its landscape setting. Nestled in the point of Gurness, almost too close to the Einhallow Sound, that's the body of water to the right. You can see that we've clearly experienced some coastal erosion on the seaside. And it sits on the mainland. The mainland of Orkney is the land you can see, and just out of shot is the island of Rousey. And this idea that it sits alone and quite isolated in the picture is actually quite a misleading thing, because the landscape was much busier when Broch was in its heyday. So here's the bird's eye perspective of the site. The Broch is obviously the main feature, the round, massive structure. When I say massive, I mean truly monumental. The walls here are over 4 metres thick, and the internal space is around 9 metres. The village surrounding Gurness is very special. It makes Gurness sort of stand out in Brochs, because it's the largest known village around a superstructure. Broch villages tend to spring up where the land's fertile enough to support larger populations. So that kind of means that all villages, all Brochs in Orkney have some sort of village, but Gurness is certainly the largest. What else do we know about them? Well, sadly, this is a much shorter list than what we don't know about them. We do know they're Middle Iron Age, which is roughly accepted as being about 400 BC to 200 AD in North Atlantic Scotland. And we know that thanks to the carbon dating, that they're actually being constructed in the main around 200 to 100 BC, and the general demise of Brochs is the late 100s, early 200 AD. They were always suspected as being Iron Age due to the sort of pottery styles and the artefacts that were coming up. In particular, we get a nice steady stream of Roman artefacts coming from the excavations, the older excavations as well, and pottery, glass, occasional coins. This quite rightly let the excavators know that the buildings were in operation in the first couple of centuries AD. It also gave the older excavators a nice, neat and tidy theory as to why Brochs exist and what the purpose of them were. And there was a big acceptance that these were somehow defensive structures against Roman coastal raiders who were picking off weak communities now and again for slaves and goods, and this would provide a source of refuge against that. Obviously, the carbon dates completely blow that out the water. We know that they're dry stone in construction, and we also know that they're not built to one specific blueprint. There's quite a lot of variety in the construction of a broch. You'll see here at Gurness, it's essentially an inner wall and an outer wall tied together at various points to retain the strength. And this creates space within those thick walls which they can use. Other brochs tend to be solid based, and then the hollow starts at a height. So it's really down to who's constructing them as in specific needs of the people who are commissioning the brochs to be built. Two features that do seem to be a requirement of building a broch are a staircase. Here at Gurness, we have a staircase coming on off a gallery here, and it runs up clockwise. Obviously, if you're talking about a community that doesn't use clocks, then we have to think of this as being sunwise. There's probably quite a significance to that. All brochs follow this pattern. It also means that we know that they're going up a height. I'll show you some examples of higher brochs in a second. And underground chamber, all brochs tend to have an underground space, which must be the primary construction feature of the broch. The one at Gurness is worth a little look here. I'll just show you this in a little bit more detail. So within the interior of the broch and underneath this metal grate that I'm encircling here is the underground chamber, or more commonly referred to as a well, because it does contain a little bit of water. The Gurness example is very striking. It's large, it's over 5 metres. It's a series of steps descending towards a little rock-cut cistern containing a few inches of water. It's always been a leap of faith to think that a little water supply can service the needs of a lot of humans and a lot of animals if needs be. I will talk a little bit more about other possibilities for the explanations of these chambers in the cairns section, but it is worth pointing out that whereas in the previous slide I mentioned that above ground in the primary phases of construction all the staircases go up in a sunwise or clockwise manner, but when we get to the underground it's the complete opposite. So nearly all the staircases we've found underneath brochs go down in an anti-clockwise or widdershins direction, which widdershins is a very powerful notion in Scottish folklore. Just a little hint that they might be thinking about the non-practical element during the construction phases. So we also know that these are houses or dwellings. There's people living and working in there on a daily basis. In fact, they're very, very hard working environments. The alternative name for a broch is an Atlantic roundhouse. And that's quite a very good description of where they're found, which we'll look at in a second, and daily use of the structure. In fact, they're so hard working that it's very hard to differentiate between what's going on inside the broch and what's actually going on outside the broch. Very similar in nature. So if it is a prominent family living in there, then the community are clearly marking status in other ways than we would assume. The main points of that being bling and luxury. Whoever's in there isn't frightened to get their sleeves rolled up and get stuck in about the daily tasks. Now, we also know that these structures and indeed the communities that surround them are a big reflection of wealth and therefore power and status. The golden rule is you don't build one of these brochs if you're struggling to get by. They're a massive drain on resources from the quarrying to the construction, and the idea in the past of these being hastily built to deter raids is simply ludicrous. This is a major undertaking, a major reflection of status. Moving away from the physical remains for a moment or two, we can have a quick look at the location of the brochs. This map of modern day Scotland, each black dot is a known or suspected broch site. And please remember that Shetland here, in reality, is much further north. You just couldn't fit it in this map. It's easy to see where the concentration is. As you get to Caithness, you can really see the concentration of brochs. And please note that they're not all on the coast. A lot of them are inland. As we get to Orkney, you see a huge amount in the mainland of Orkney and surrounding islands. There's just over 180 known and suspected broch sites in Orkney and a similar amount in Shetland. All in all, each black dot amounts to just well over 500 known and suspected sites. Now, it may sound strange that I'm saying suspected sites because they are such big remains, but they're not always obvious. A lot of them are grassed over, and they've certainly made very handy quarries over the last few centuries, and some have been victims of ploughing as well, and modern construction over the top of some of them in towns. So we do have enough physical remains, though, and enough to get a real sense of the original appearance of these brochs. So if we have a look at some of the Dunteld here on the west coast of Scotland, walls of several metres thick can obviously support great heights. So we see a better representation than at Gurness of the original appearance. Further northwest, we have Duncarloway on the Isle of Lewis, a real monster of a broch, and you see the double-skinned idea being tied together. You can also see these sort of relieving arches. We think this is for weight distribution or over openings, etc. Moving across to Caithness, we have this wonderful dramatic setting at Nibster in the north point of Caithness. As you get to the top part of Caithness, you start seeing more around the broch, such as the settlement and, of course, the ditches and the demarcation lines. And no broch presentation or talk would be complete if we didn't have good old Mooser broch in Shetland, the ultimate broch remains. This is a closer look at Mooser, showing the staggering level of preservation of a prehistoric building. Its profile, Mooser still stands to a height of over 13 metres. And that's fantastic because we only have to debate the appearance of the roof, which we think was organic because it's basically absent. And we don't have to debate what the appearance of a broch looked like in its heyday. With that in mind, we can head back to Gurness, having a fair idea of what the original appearance would have looked like. And it's made a bit easier here by the pencil projection onto the existing remains by the wonderful broch academic Tanya Romankiewicz. Still very many fundamental questions that we just simply can't answer. I'm going to choose two here, just in the interest of time. We don't know who built the brochs. Now, this works on two different levels. We literally don't know because we only find a tiny, tiny percentage of the dead from this quite lengthy period. They're doing something with their dead that doesn't leave an archaeological trace, such as excarnation or, as I strongly suspect myself, some kind of processing involving the sea. From the couple of hundred or the few hundred, mainly bits of human bone from the Middle Iron Age, most are found in and around the brochs, and they tend to be deposited along with the demise of the building, the end of the building. And there's also a real concentration in and around the entrance passage area. We also don't know if broch builders were a travelling band of skilled tradesmen, commissioned by local authority and using and overseeing local labour, or if the communities themselves were entirely responsible for the design and execution of the building. Secondly, the jackpot question, are they defensive? Well, they look defensive, and that's always going to win the first impression battle. But when you look at it, when you nitpick away at the purely defensive argument of a broch, then it can be heavily diluted, right down to just being another facet of a multi-purpose building. They have gone to great pains to let you know that this is a powerful, important and no-nonsense community. Your first impression of Gurness, even when you stand in front of the complex looking at it from this angle, in the slide here, even in its ruinous state today, you still get a strong sense of the architecture working as a tool of intimidation. It's theatrical, it's almost like a castle, but you've got to remember it's over 1,000 years before any castles as we know them made an appearance on the British Isles. Another factor in the defensive argument, against the defensive argument, is that they have absolutely no archaeological evidence to date of any being attacked. And this is despite those communities facing probably the biggest threat known up to that point in the invasion and occupation by the Roman Empire. There's absolutely no way several hundred wealthy, powerful Brochs with a massive supporting population would go unnoticed by Rome. This means that the people in charge of these Brochs are playing politics with the Roman Empire, and quite successfully. Rome wouldn't just see this area in the north of Scotland as a military threat. They would also see it as a potential to muscle in on the agricultural resources that are driving the success and sustaining the success of these communities. Following on from the castle analogy of Brochs, it was quite popular for a time in Broch studies to view these structures in a similar light to castles. It was a popular idea that a Broch complex and the tower was controlling large swathes of land and estates. As you can see from this map of the Broch site in the vicinity of Gurness, mainly along the two coasts of Einhallow Sound, here's Gurness here, that the area is far too crowded for that to work. Even allowing for varying building dates, there's a major overlap of these Brochs. For example, up here in Rowsey, then we have North, Mid and South Howe, all situated within 400 metres of each other. So as I mentioned at the start, Gurness was actually in the middle of a bustling Broch corridor, rather than existing in a relative isolation. It's just another example of how Brochs don't conform to any of the rules that we try and apply to them, which makes them frustrating and endearing in equal measure. So what can we say about Gurness? What do we know about the site as it stands today? Well, this is a site in 1930. It was excavated formally in 1930. It's hard to imagine that this is the iconic view up through the village towards the Broch entrance. But this is what they look like pre-excavation. It was actually discovered the previous year in 1929 by a local archaeology enthusiast, Robert Rendell, and the landowner Percy Wood, who decided to see what was under this suspicious mound. They dug around the mound for about 4 hours before revealing a staircase leading down from the top of the mound into the depths. At that point, they realised they had something serious going on. The National Monuments Inspector for the Ministry of Works, Jamie Richardson, seen here on the left, was actually in Orkney at the time and put an instant stop to the amateur investigation. He realised the potential of the site, and he went away and secured funding to excavate formally and employed the Secretary of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, James Hewitt Craw, who's pictured to the right of the slide here. He was also a very prolific and experienced archaeologist. Craw died shortly after his 4th year, very unexpectedly, as a site director in 1933. But the excavation carried on under several other directors until 1939, when the outbreak of the Second World War put an end to the excavation. The loss of Hewitt Craw was a huge blow to how Gurness is perceived and understood even to this day. He never got a chance to publish anything formal, and so a lot of the information, the raw excavation, died with him. Another setback was that his boss, essentially, Jamie Richardson, was well known for his reluctance to write anything down. His peers called it a unwillingness of his pen. However, in 1933, Hewitt Broch did make an address to the Society of Antiquaries in Edinburgh. This is a result of them funding the excavation, so they need a report back. And here he did reveal an idea of his site phasing. He reckoned that there were 4 phases of occupation. The first being a very obvious one, the Broch builders, the people who built the Broch and the village and dug the ditches. A secondary occupation where the Broch was still more or less intact, still holding up, but they were making changes within. And that's quite valid. You know, they're constantly making changes within the Broch, but there is a big secondary phase. This feature that Hewitt Broch is actually looking at here is clearly secondary. It's simply pressed up against the original wall, and behind him is also pressed up against the wall is this secondary staircase, which is the same staircase that was first discovered in 1929, which I showed you in the previous slide. Third phase, the Broch's starting to crumble now, but people are clinging to the structure and trying to make the best of it. And its fourth phase was when the Broch's gone, it's ruinous, the village is dilapidated, people are building huts on top of the debris, the old village buildings have been given over to being blacksmiths' workshops. There's a lot of serious metal working going on artefactually in the parts of the village. And he reckoned that whole 4 phases was over 900 years. So that's quite a sweeping general phasing. We know through excavation that people are constantly tinkering and changing their surroundings to suit themselves. In 1987, the late John Hedges tried to consolidate everything around Gurness, make a formal report as best as he could, and it was a great resource, and he further broke down these phases of occupation, but it's an almost impossible task without raw data. So leaving the seemingly stalemate situation at the Gurness, we head quite a way south, but still within the Orkney archipelago, to South Ronaldsay, and the area of Winnock Bay, which is the site of the ongoing excavation at the cairns. The site is the grey patch that you can see in the sort of middle of the landscape picture here. And it's here in 2006 that Martin Carruthers and the team from the University of the Highlands and Islands investigated an early 20th century report of Iron Age remains. And we've been there ever since. When you see this overhead picture of the cairn site, it's very easy to see why we've spent so long here. What's been revealed so far is a multi-period site spanning around 1300 years, and that's without getting to the lower levels. And obviously the most dramatic phase of that period is the Broch structure that you can see slowly but surely emerging from the depths. It is a work in progress, so we don't know when it was built. Strong carbon dates for it being ended in the late 100s AD. It's a solid based Broch with its double-skinned walls starting at above ground level. We know this because we still have the first few treads of the staircase in this area. Of course, it's rising up in a clockwise direction. Similar to Gurness, the village buildings that are currently hidden under this protective layer have been very much given over to metalworking. But in this case, we can actually equate that to being at the same time as the Broch's demise. From the very start of the removal of the rubble, you can see that process on the top left of the screen. We started finding little patterns that didn't fit in with what we'd anticipated to find. What we'd anticipated to find was a chaotic mess of infill brought on by the dramatic collapse of the tower. Quite often, artefacts such as stone tools were placed against orthostats and the inner Broch wall, as you can see in these three pictures here. At varying heights throughout the rubble as well, and sometimes at varying heights against the same orthostat. Also, we were finding small groupings of artefacts, caches, as you can see in this picture, stone tools and a couple of bones. And also the rubble itself seemed to have been carefully placed rather than toppled in certain areas. You can just see this is two pictures of the same thing. This one's slightly clearer. Looks like structure, but it turned out to be absolutely nothing. It's almost as if they destroyed the tower in a careful, methodical manner, much more than we first thought and anticipated. There were bone deposits throughout the rubble, lots of whalebone, and associated bone groups, or ABGs for short. One is in the bottom left here. This is just under the rubble, and on a single slab we found bones from cow, deer, seal and sheep, mainly the scapula or shoulder bones of these animals, all sitting severely weathered, so they've been outside for a long time before being brought into the Broch and placed around this slab. Strange little anomalies continued to be observed throughout the last floor levels of the Broch immediately beneath the rubble infill. You can see here on this slide that some artefacts are starting to emerge from a dark burnt layer, boxed in by some orthostats here and here, and to the left, the inner wall face of the Broch structure itself. When we lifted this slab, we actually found quite a strange little thing, that there was the base of a pot stuck to the underside of that slab. What this means is that somebody has upturned the pot, put it upside down on a stone slab, came along with another slab and deliberately smashed it and just left it. And over time the base of the pot is stuck to the underside. This is the resultant pot spread, quite a substantial pot spread, and actually more than one vessel is represented. Just a metre or so away from this, you can see that deposit completely cleaned out at the background. Started finding another associated bone group. This time it was a portion of sheep vertebra sitting on a slab, upside down, I might add. It's been deliberately placed there, whilst there's still been flesh or meat on those bones. And little did we know that this stone that was the vertebrae was sitting on, when we removed it, actually turned out to be one of the stone slabs that was sealing and concealing our very own underground chamber within the Broch. This is the underground chamber. Before the water was removed, and this picture here showing the water during removal, during the pumping out of the chamber. you can see stairs appearing, and as normal, they curve to the left, or the anti-clockwise. Here is the water removed, and we can see the foot of the stairs ready to be excavated. It didn't take us long before we realised that we'd stumbled upon the holy grail of any archaeological site, anaerobic conditions. This black, sticky, smelly mess of loveliness is the perfectly preserved 2,000-year-old organics placed into this space by the last people to use it. During the 100% sampling of this material, we noticed wooden artefacts and objects throughout this material, including this. Now, this may seem like a very unimpressive mud lump. When it was analysed in post-ex, it was a beautiful lathe-turned wooden alder bowl. Now, this had been in use for a very long time. Several repairs in various styles. It was clearly very important to the users for whatever function it provided that it was kept in working order. And as the well or the underground chamber was being sealed, this was placed onto what appears to be a reed mat on top of some of the organic stuff. Now, we also analysed the contents of this bowl, and it does appear that it was full of a dairy product when it was put into the underground chamber for the last time, either milk, cheese. Now, as if that wasn't enough, at the very bottom of the chamber, the cistern, you may just be able to see here that we started pulling out hair. It's since been confirmed to be human, and it's maybe not a surprise. We thought that a hole in the middle of the broch may attract hair, kind of like a plug hole does in a modern sink. But what we weren't prepared for was, under the microscope, it was actually cut. Each strand was cut at both ends. So this makes this look as if these strands of hair have also been deliberately placed down into that underground chamber. This puts a whole new perspective on the function and significance and the role of underground chambers. I think we can safely say there's more to them than just being a water source or a well. Now, around the same time as they were filling the chamber full of organic offerings, sealing it off with slabs and putting portions of meat on top of it, there was also a spectacular act of closure taking place outside the Broch entrance. Just where the two excavators are, as they were working through very rich animal bone and shell deposit, a term which we in Scotland use as a midden material, so the detritus of food, essentially. Part of a human jawbone was revealed and discovered. This is in situ. This is a close-up of that jawbone, and this picture to the right is the post-ex, the cleaned-up version. We think he's a male, and of a decent age for the time, probably upwards of 60. He's clearly had quite a rough time of it, dental health through his life, but clearly an important individual. No real surprise that a human jawbone or a part of a human remains came up near and in and around the Broch entrance. As I said earlier on, this is quite common, but we started thinking there was more to it when we excavated further and found that the jawbone that was sitting here was actually part of, sitting on top of a hollowed out whale vertebra that you can see appearing in this picture here. As you can see, the more we excavated, the more there was to the deposit. It developed quite substantially. This was a discovery in 2016, so we've had a number of years to gather post-ex information, and we're quite confident that we have the sequence of events for this deposit. It was a single event. Several carbon dates have helped us with that. We know that things were deposited at the same time. And essentially, what a community has done here is had a feast and gathered up the detritus from that feast. There's a very animal bone and shell rich organic waste, or midden as we call it. Nearly 300 animal bones and countless shells. And some of that was spread outside the Broch, onto which a hollowed out fin whale vertebra, burnt incidentally, was placed into that bucket essentially. Some neonate lambs, some saithfish bones, and on top of all that, the human jawbone that we saw in the previous slide. Another development was the discovery of two right-sided, naturally shed red deer antler placed tightly together against the left-hand side of the vertebra. The whole thing was pinned against the Broch wall here by an almighty saddle quern. This took 4 or 5 of us to lift this off the site when it moved through excavation. So this is pinning the whole thing onto the site and keeping it in place. And then more midden material, more organic matter was placed over the top of it all. And then finally, you can still see a remnant of this here. The whole thing was sort of boxed in by loose stone and carefully slabbed over. Now this is clearly to protect it from the ensuing rubble and weight of the destructive rubble from the demolition of the Broch Tower. And we know that this happened at exactly the precise same time as they were preparing the final floors in the Broch for the same destruction event. We know this because the DNA analysis from this fin whale has actually shown it to be the same animal as 18 other pieces of fin whale from inside the Broch found on various guises as closing deposits and within the rubble. This gives us an incredible insight into how methodical, how serious a community took the major change that they have undertaken bringing down a Broch structure. So what lessons have we learned from the cairns? What do we take away from the findings of the cairns? Well, the obvious one is that the Broch structure is far beyond the practical. It does serve a practical, it fulfills a practical service, but it's very, very clear that the community and the individuals who live in the Broch are spiritually invested in this structure. You know, almost as if the structure is a living thing. If it's a living thing, then all living things have to die. So when they have taken the decision to end this building, then they've done so in a very controlled and methodical way. And that involves protocol. So they know that in order to let this building go and move on, they need to do certain things, such as seal the underground chamber, put deposits down there, put deposits at the entrance, and a whole series of deposits and individual, and from the individual to the dramatic across the whole Broch interior before introducing the rubble and letting the building go for good. So is there any implications for Gurness from the evidence produced at the cairns? Or do we just have to accept that Gurness is an archaeological dead end? Well, I'm delighted to tell you that by revisiting the original Gurness documents and assemblage with new questions, and as well as pursuing new lines of inquiry, which have actually paid dividends, there is actually a lot of similarity between the two sites at the end of the primary Broch phase. So I've selected 5 examples just to give you an idea of where I'm going with this. Number 1 is at the foot of the stairs. A great number of animal bones were found, including horned sheep, Celtic ox, pig, dog, pine marten, whalebone, a load of charcoal and a hammerstone, all in one slab. The second example is just outside the Broch. It's a human remains, where there was a throwaway comment about on the final Broch flooring level, a human jawbone was found immediately outside the Broch entrance. So this is very much in keeping with Broch tradition, almost. Third example is back inside the Broch, and somewhere in this region, and whilst removing the final Broch paving, a jawless cattle skull was found of a rare type. So, not much to go on, but these things don't get there by accident. Outside the Broch, into the village, number 4 is a deliberately smashed pot. Now, this is very, very similar to the cairns, and the actual report I can show you here, and it says, in a chamber thus uncovered, 3 groups of pottery fragments, each obviously belonging to a single pot, were found. 2 of the pots were bottom upwards and had been crushed by a stone. So they're upturning stone and deliberately crushing the pot and just leaving it, exactly like the cairns. The 5th deposit is again in the village. It's just slightly just to the right of that picture, and this is almost a foundational deposit. This is it here on the right hand side, and it was a pot covered deliberately with a flat stone to protect it, and on the top of the whole thing a wall was built. This was discovered because it was in the way of the barrow run early in the excavations. So where do we go from here? Well, hopefully I've shown that there's new ground to be gained by challenging some of the long accepted views of older sites, and that if you ask new questions, sometimes you get new answers. So I think keep digging, and I mean this in 2 different ways. I'll certainly carry on taking the fresh evidence from modern excavations and feeding it back into Gurness and similar sites. But the more new information we can gather, the better we can understand the older information. But I also mean keep digging for that older information. There's a lot of stuff hiding out there that needs to be brought to light again. And there are several other 100 sites that could do with the same treatment as I've given Gurness. So if anybody fancies a challenge, then please do get in touch and let me know. Finally, I'd just like to say thanks to my friends and colleagues from both the cairns and Gurness. And again, a big thanks to the team here today for letting me present. Cheers.
There we go.
Yeah, dear Kevin, thank you very much. This was quite an exciting presentation and quite mysterious type of building. I've never seen this before, and I'm really curious to know more about the function and the structure of these brochs. And my very first question before someone else dares to use the question and answer or the chat function, in terms of the construction, of these brochs. We have an inner and an outer wall, an inner and an outer mantle. What is there in between? Was there earth, soil? Was the space used for sacrifices or as devotement space? What is the fill between these two mantles?
Of course, well, in the case of Gurness, it's actually just a channel. It's a very narrow channel. But when it was excavated, they actually found that it was partially paved. And this is the problem. If you believe my argument that people the communities are deliberately ending this broch and doing little strange things. I mean, it's not all strange. There's a huge amount in these brochs that are everyday, you know. So, but it's very hard to see what was everyday detritus and what's a deposit. You know, it's often the grouping. But in the case of Gurness, and in very many brochs, a lot of the channels are fire blackened. You know, so a lot of the cells have actually got smoke damage and things. So, and this is this is the when you get into broch arguments, they argue about absolutely everything, as I'm sure anybody in academia knows. So the questions about these channels, obviously we know there's a staircase, but that doesn't take up all the room. So people are wondering, when you see the appearance of a broch, how does it ventilate, you know, and how does air currents travel through it? So people were thinking that sometimes it's a drainage system, so there's water coming down, you know, and filtering out. I don't know how much I believe that. Some people were thinking that that it is for sort of distributing heat through the building. You know, so there's no answer. You know, this is the beauty of brochs. You know, they don't give the game away. You know, something so big we know so little about. But they're certainly using these spaces and things. You know, it's a very uncomfortable spaces. You know, they are quite. Can't go in them if you don't like spiders, etc. I don't know. I know I'm not answering your question very well, but the reason is we don't know.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think Christian is the next one.
Yes, thank you. When I saw the brochs, I thought very much for the famous nuraghe of the island of Sardinia and the Mediterranean, which are a World Heritage. And is it possible to compare the brochs with the nuraghe of Sardinia? They are discussed very controversial and contradictory as castles, temples, or storages for grain, if I remember.
Well, yeah, this comes up quite often. The one thing to remember is the nuraghe are much older than the brochs. The idea was a very popular idea that there was some sort of diffusion. So the idea or a broch was coming from elsewhere and travelling round the coast, spreading that idea. Now, we can't really say for certain. There's a strong argument for something. I know some of my colleagues are dead against the idea that nuraghe and brochs just don't meet. You know, their argument is that it's a very much a human solution to build in the round. On that same token, we have churches in China that are quite similar looking to brochs. We've got buildings in Romania that were quite similar looking. You know, it just seems to be a sort of human solution. The idea that the building brochs had to come from somewhere else was actually quite a kind of British colonial sort of idea that, you know, people in the north of Scotland and communities in the north of Scotland were never really seen as being very intelligent. They were always seen as being quite primitive, and therefore they had to be given this sort of technology. Excavations, though, in Orkney are quite interesting because there's a place. Brochs they don't just appear. we're starting to see that there's a growth in the roundhouse from about 600 BC, and it's bigger and bigger and bigger, and then eventually it culminates in a broch. So I think rather than broch just appearing, we are actually seeing a development from the roundhouse to a broch. You know, we have buildings that we don't classify as brochs, but they are getting up towards 2.5 to 3 meters thick. It's a very, well, you pick a side and see what you think. But yeah, the Nuragi thing it comes up very, very often, and there's no real way of disproving it or proving it, to be honest. But personally, I think that the communities in Scotland and in the Atlantic zone were complex enough to develop brochs themselves. But we're travellers, so you never know where they've went on holiday. Get the idea.
Thanks. David.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Kevin. I've got lots of things to ask here, but I guess is it fitting in with Christian's question really is a sort of idea about similarities and differences. And I guess, as you rightly said, I suppose you could say there's a similarity. I see these things and I immediately think in some ways, some examples on Inishmore on the west of Ireland, in Aran Islands, or with the subterranean chambers, the fugus in West Cornwall, which is where I'm from, near Penzance, other end of the country. And I'm sort of seeing similarities. And as I think you so quite rightly said, it's if there is a similarity, then in some ways there's a similarity of the way in which people make assumptions, particularly British archaeologists come along and make an assumption about often the stupidity of the locals. This must have been built by a passing band of Phoenicians or something, and so there's similar colonial attitudes that certain areas get subjected to. But I guess another way of thinking it in terms of differences is when I first saw a broch. It must have been 30 odd years ago. Went to Glenelg and scrambled around, managed to get to the very top of one of the ones you showed there. I've been to Musa and so on. And in some ways, as you sort of said, there's an obvious similarity of these places, but could there also be a regionality in brochs? And are there some differences? And is it a case that the categorization of broch is it unhelpful sometimes, and that we should be thinking about how Carloway is different to Glenelg, is different to Gurness, and thinking about that?
Completely. The way I tend to try and think about brochs or try and explain them as houses. You know, they are houses, so why not compare them as houses? So if you take every one of us has a house, I'm assuming, and everybody knows that if there's an upper floor, there'll be a staircase. You know, if there's a room, there's a bedroom, there's a toilet. But how we use that function is, you know, how we use our own houses is completely different. You know, so it's a kind of similar thing. There is major. I wouldn't even say it's regionality. There tends to be more hollow skinned brochs in the Western Isles, which makes Gurness quite strange in an Orcadian sort of setting, because Orcadian brochs tend to be solid based. So there is slight regionality, but it's unfair to compare them, and this feeds into the interpretation, because up to now, people try and explain brochs, all 500-600 of them, for one explanation. You know, and it's completely unfair, because people are in a different situation. You know, and it's something that I'm very conscious about, in the way that, you know, I have put the argument across that people are using brochs and they know that there's something they have to do if that broch's ended. It's probably fear driven. There's probably a fear of the ancestors and the gods. If they don't behave, you know, they might have to meet them someday and explain why they didn't, formally close a broch. But if I'm putting that out there and I'll make some research over all the brochs, I'm not expecting to find every broch being the same. So it's very unhelpful to lump them all in together. You know, it's a nice. They're certainly buying into something. You know, if you decide to build a broch, there's a reason for that. You know, and not everybody gets to live in a broch in the Iron Age. It's not as if that's the only choice. As I said, it's probably you only build one if you're wealthy enough. But yeah, this is the stuff that keeps me up at night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Fascinating. And as far as I understand this, there are no windows in it and neither some kind of fireplace or heating or anything else?
Well, there is hearths. And so we know that they have some form of heat. But when you see like some Musa and the other examples, then it's very unlikely that these things have windows. You know, the walls are too thick as well. But this makes it it just confuses the situation, because now then we argue about the roof. You know, the roof overhang, and therefore there's no walkway at the top, or was it inside? If you think these are defensive, then that's a very unpractical thing. You know, if you can't see who's attacking you, so if you're laying siege to a broch, then you know, if everybody's inside a broch, then if you're outside, then just be very quiet until somebody opens the door to see if you're, you know, and if, the other thing about that is, yeah, there's just strange buildings, but as I said, they're so enigmatic. But yeah, there's doesn't tend to be, it'd be very dark. And this is another thing I didn't include at the top because obviously time constraints, but we excavated that cairns, we found one stone lamp. And as far as I can tell, when the excavation at Gurness, from that whole broch, there was no stone lamps. We're very fortunate because we do have one broch that was actually burnt down by accident, a tragic fire at Clachdall in Assynt. And they never come back, they never reused the building, they came back and just toppled it. Several years later, there was a build-up of sand between the big black burnt there and the rubble. When they excavated that, they found like 26, 27 lamps or something like that. So they're artificially lighting the building. I know I'm not giving any clear-cut answers here, but there isn't any clear-cut answers.
Peter, you are muted. You should unmute. We can't hear you.
That was the easiest question.
Write it in the chat, maybe.
Yeah, just try to write it into the chat. In between, I have a further question. What about the relationship between the brochs and the settlements? You showed this very interesting map where it was obvious that the brochs were very close to the water network and to the rivers and to the sea. What about the ordinary Iron Age settlements or villages and the relationship to the brochs?
Yeah, we don't really know, to be honest. You know, there isn't even any real evidence yet. That we have no evidence whatsoever that one broch was communicating with the other broch. When I say communicating, we knew each other was there, but we don't have any evidence of trade or anything like that. But I think, you know, what we do have evidence in brochs is that there is, I think somebody mentioned that in the question, that there's an awful lot of grain being brought into these brochs, either for processing or in some of the broch excavation in Shetland at Galloway. They found so much grain that they assumed that this was being a grain store of some sort. You know, so part of the function of a broch is to store the grain. Now, I don't think that that's entirely for keeping it dry or anything. I think the surrounding landscape is bringing, you know, it's a non-monetary economy, so they're bringing their grain to a central point. after which it can be redistributed by whoever's in charge. You know, so that might hint that there's a wider sort of landscape, you know, that might incorporate some of the sort of poorer elements of society that can't or deemed not important enough to sort of be near that Broch Tower, you know. So there will be an extension, and even sort of like who's looking after the fields and things, so the farmers and stuff. But yeah, I think there will be a relationship between ordinary Iron Age and Broch settlements. It's probably just pay your tribute and, you know, like your tenancy and things like that. If that makes sense.
Thanks. I just see the question from Dieter. Are the ditches part of the original Broch?
Yep. It's a very good question, and it's one that again splits opinion. Brochs don't tend to be on virgin ground. They're just a phase, and it's very, very common for a Broch to be sitting on a Neolithic settlement. Sometimes, in the case of the How, they had actually scalped a Neolithic tomb and built the Broch on it. You know, so the siting of the Broch is another probably quite important thing. You know, they're creating a link with past by building directly on it. Now, the other thing about that is you've got to remember that us looking back 2,000 years, the Broch builders is the same as the Broch builders same time as the Broch builders looking back to the Neolithic settlements of Orkney. So we don't know if it's a legitimate claim, or is it, you know, do they feel a connection? But they are looking at older sites to build on. In the case of the Broch at Gurness, it's quite an Iron Age looking ditch, if I can say that. You know, it's very sinuousy. It almost touches. You only have to be on the site at the same time as a school trip, know that they're not very defensive. They can be clambered over very, very easily. They're shallow, and the other thing is they're actually oceaning up the ditch. They're building their own causeways across. So unless the ditches at the Broch of Gurness are palisaded, then I think it's just a space. It's a way of marking space rather than sort of being a big defensive ditch. This is the problem with the excavation, though. If it was excavated in modern times, we would certainly be able to see if they kept that ditch quite clean. Were they recutting it? If they're recutting the ditch, they need it for a reason. But I'm certainly convinced it's part of the original Broch settlement. But I don't know what function it served. I wouldn't put my last pound on it that it was a defensive thing rather than this is the Broch zone now. You know, it's a way of marking space.
David.
Yeah, thank you again. My own background is not less archaeology and more heritage studies, you see, so I'm interested in some of the contemporary questions on this, and particularly, I mean, it's a very striking photo of it right next to the beach, and it's clearly, I'd imagine it's probably a little bit under threat of sea level today, and you know, potentially similar to some other sites in Shetland, actually well-known World Heritage sites in Shetland, which are also on the beach or very close to the beach and under threat, as well as the one what's it called, up in Papa Westray. There's a really nice, which is right on the beach again. Yes, that's right. And I'm thinking, you know, in terms of the contemporary protection and some of the decisions being made today in terms of whether to go for sort of hard protection of a site or a larger landscape and how much money that would cost, issues about moving things and whether that's an ethical thing to do or not, or maybe just to, you know, record it, let it go, let it just, you know, and record its decay. And it struck me listening to your talk there about that ritual site, that you use the phrase about all living things have to die, and a controlled and methodical management of decay, and a sort of a very purposeful sense of letting go. And
Yeah.
can we learn something from these earlier people in terms of how we deal with that site today and looking forward into the future?
Well, yeah, it's a very good point. And I think I don't think we've got an option. I think once the sea levels rises, these things are going to, we're going to have to think about how we manage things. The site in question up here is Skara Brae. Skara Brae is, but here's the, it's part of life, and I actually believe that the people knew that back then. Sea level rise and climate change is not new, so we know that Skara Brae was probably abandoned because of climate change. An ingression by the sea. So they saw it with their own eyes. So it would probably influence their sort of like thinking. One of the other things was it's almost a bit selfish, really, of us. I'm thinking about things like to use an example, like the Scar Viking boat burial up on Sandy in Orkney. There's a part of me that thinks that people were buried near the sea because they knew that the sea was going to take them. We've actually denied that. Okay, it might take 1,000 years or so, but we've actually stopped that. Once you start looking, I struggled with that with the excavation of the well, or the underground chamber at the cairns. Should we be taking this ball away? It all depends on your belief. But it's always a bit selfish because we learned so much from that. But those people have let go. Those people have yeah. It's Gurness is. I'm quite glad to say that Gurness isn't really under much threat. Part of the consolidation was, you might remember, that there's artificial cliff. It's cemented cliffs across the edge. So, and it's a bizarre thing because I've never seen, in Ironhallow Sound, there's a ferocious body of water, but as chaotic as I've seen it, I've never seen Gurness getting any wave damage, so it makes the coastal erosion quite a bizarre thing, really. It must have been a kind of freak storm almost that took that side of the way. But yeah, it's a very, I didn't realise I was using such sort of deep language, to be honest, but I do think it's.
I thought it was a very effective language to use. It really put the image in mind of sort of contemporary management issues. And good. I guess as an extension, is it sort of, what's the relationship with the local community in that part of Orkney today in terms of how they're involved in the management of this site, or what relation, where's the site within their lives, people who live there today?
People love it, but nobody really knows anything about it. The relationship with the community is really just it's a place to go. It's almost a kind of sanctuary. It's memories of people who worked there and things. There's no real great interest from the locals in this, like about the Broch as a functioning building. It's a place to the kids. It's a very open place. You'll remember. It's not under lock and key. It's so it's a place to jump the fence at night rather than a locked up monument. And that's the kind of thing that I get, and I love it. It's a great part of it. I'll give you a good reason. An example. I read a paper on the structure of the Broch, and it touched on Gurness, and saying that there was really, they had fire. They had fire at the localized fire in the walls. The walls were scorched and things like that. And this was then went into a big, deep and meaningful thing about what that meant. Then when I was working there, a local woman came and says, "Oh, I've not been here for years. In fact, I feel very guilty because we used to light fires in the Broch in the 70s, And so it's that kind of. My neighbour was telling me about falling down the underground chamber, into the water as a kid and things. So the relationship's a very affectionate one, but it's based mainly on it being a public monument rather than history. And to be honest, everybody's almost got their own Broch in Orkney. There's the people in the local community have got 2 or 3 other Brochs. between the closest village and Gurness. So yeah, people are. But having said that, I suppose it's a horrible way of finding out. But during the lockdown, somebody damaged part of the site. So somebody's vandalised part of the site, and the public outcry for that was quite serious, you know. So it's a horrible way of finding out what a building means to somebody if once somebody starts messing with it a little bit. So that's quite it's not something that I'd like to see again, but it's a good way of gauging the public attitude towards Gurness.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was very interesting.
I don't see further questions. Dieter says his micro doesn't work at all, which is sadly, but in case you have a question, Dieter, don't hesitate to put it into the chat. No, you don't? Well, so it's my part to say many thanks to the panelists for your questions and to the audience for your interest and participation. And last but not least to Kevin for his really, really impressive and exciting presentation, which leaves us with more questions than we had before. But as you said, it's simply a thing of go on digging. So thank you very much. Allow me to advertise for our next presentation held by Innocent Pikirai about Great Zimbabwe. So we stay in the same age, but change the continent and go to Southeastern Africa. So have a nice day. Thank you very much for your participation and have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Rainer. Thank you, Kevin. Bye bye.
Welcome.